David W. Simmons, Deputy Management Counselor, U.S. Mission to NATO in Brussels, Belgium, has been a Foreign Service Officer since 1996 and has served in U.S. embassies in Athens, Greece, Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, and Caracas, Venezuela. Prior to joining the U.S. Department of State, Simmons held successive positions with the U.S. Office of Personnel Management, or OPM, as they're known, as an investigator, an area representative, and a personnel management specialist, which afforded him the opportunity to travel widely throughout the Rocky Mountains and southwestern United States, with duty stations in Salt Lake City, Phoenix, and Denver. Following a 2-year mission for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in France and the West Indies, Simmons attended the University of Utah, graduating cum laude with bachelor's degrees in economics and political science. We've afforded him a visa to come onto campus today. And he also received a master's degree in international management from the American Graduate School of International Management, or Thunderbird. I mentioned to him, and I know that there's a lot of interest in graduate school. We've found it's like 75% of our students are planning to go into graduate school, and that's a very interesting program for a lot of students. He speaks French, Spanish, and Greek. Simmons is married to the former Mandy Caddick of Manchester, England, and they are parents of 3 children, Emily, Zachary, and Jacob, one of whom I understand is just starting out with EFY this week. Would that be Emily? Yep. All right. So, again, we're very grateful to welcome Mr. David W. Simmons.
Okay. I would like to thank Corey Leonard for the introduction, for the opportunity to speak here today, and I'd also like to thank the David M. Kennedy Center for International Studies and the officers and students of the Foreign Service Student Organization. It's an honor to be here with you today. I'm feeling a little bit stiff standing here at the podium, but especially with a group like this, you'd be warned that I'd be standing next to you, probably spitting on you if it weren't for the podcast, so be grateful for that. I'll stay at the microphone where that helps. The Department of State professional recruiters have put together a slideshow presentation that I think is a good guide for overall knowledge of how to go about looking for jobs in the Foreign Service. So we'll go through that. I'll probably go through quickly unless there are specific questions to just sort of give you a feel. A lot of people that are interested in the Foreign Service, especially with the number of Foreign Service officers that seem to have been coming through, may be familiar with this. So I don't want to belabor any of it, but I'll make sure that we answer whatever questions you have. And then I'm open for discussion. As Mr. Leonard said, I've been around a little bit in the Foreign Service. I've been living overseas with my family for 11 years. We haven't been back to Washington except for required training and sessions there. We've lived in Greece and Venezuela and Saudi Arabia, and there have been a lot of interesting experiences that have happened then. So I can answer questions about those things if you'd like, and talk about how it's impacted our family, children, and obviously the church, and what our role has been overseas for those of you who might be interested in some of those things. So we will start with the website, which of course is one of the most important things you're going to get out of this, because with the internet today, you can probably get far more information presented nice and slick and very well on the internet. I've been spending a little bit of time the last few days in preparation for this, looking at what the Department of State has put out there, and frankly, there's a lot of good video and a lot of good information there. So I encourage you to look at the internet. But what you can't get is the personal experience and the charming personality of those that come to lecture for you. We ran into somebody today who was a little unsure of what the Department of State is. So I imagine those of you who are interested in international affairs are aware of it, but very brief explanation for those who aren't. The Department of State is the oldest cabinet bureau in the United States government. It's headed by Dr. Condoleezza Rice and has primary responsibility for the administration of foreign policy for the United States government, for advising the president. We staff and support U.S. embassies and consulates. We have about 285 of them overseas now. And that You can see we look to be represented in the Department of State in the same way that the United States is represented. That is to say, we're looking for a diverse group of individuals to serve as Foreign Service officers and specialists overseas that represent all aspects of American life. We're going to talk today about what it is to be a Foreign Service officer, what it is to be a Foreign Service specialist, what it is to work in the civil service, because there are a lot of good opportunities in those programs as well. And for some of you that may be interested in getting a taste of the State Department or the Foreign Service before you graduate, what student programs there are. First, we'll talk about Foreign Service officers. There are 5 basic career tracks in the Foreign Service as an officer. These folks are all called generalists. That means we come from a variety of backgrounds. We do a variety of things. And you enter the Foreign Service through the infamous Foreign Service written exam. We call each of these career tracks cones. I don't know if that's from the 1970s Saturday Night Live era, when most of you weren't alive, but they had the cone heads. If you get the old videos, you'll enjoy that. But we have 5 cones or career tracks. Management officers are those who do the logistics at an embassy. That's the career track that I'm in. We do personnel, finance, we run motor pools, we make sure there are the supplies and the services that are needed to make the embassy work. We have economics officers who basically study what's going on in the economy of the country or the organization that they're assigned to and how that impacts U.S. foreign policy. And they do analysis and send that into the decision makers in Washington. Political officers down at the bottom do similar work to the economic officers, except that their focus is more on what's happening in the politics of the country that they're in. Consular officers are those that make the news more often because they're the ones that are busy working when there are earthquakes or when you're overseas and your passport gets lost and you have to go to the embassy looking for a new one. The consular officers will help you. They are also the ones that interview people and they're looking for visas to come to the United States and make decisions about whether people can come to the United States or not. It's interesting because prior to 9/11, I was in Saudi Arabia. And I was very well aware of the consular program and how you went about getting visas there. I was glad that I was not a consular officer after the attacks in the United States. But I understood what had happened, and these folks, unfortunately, took a lot of negative heat for doing their jobs the way they were instructed to do them. We can, again, talk about that more if you'd like later in questions and answers. Majority of careers are spent overseas. It used to be that they said about 60% of your career was spent overseas, and most of the rest of it was in Washington, D.C. Some of us, as I mentioned, have been lucky enough to spend 100% of our careers overseas so far. Washington's a great place if you have to go there. Overseas, there are a lot of things happening. Embassy is a different environment than working in a headquarters. So there is a lot of opportunity all over the world. As I mentioned, it used to be about 60% of your career was spent overseas, but there has been a recent focus on spending more time overseas. So the department, as it evolves, is trying to encourage people to actually stay out more than that. You have to be at least 21 when you're appointed, and you have to be available for worldwide assignment. That means you have to be willing to go wherever the department sends you. Now, the department doesn't sort of arbitrarily throw darts at the map and decide that's where you're going. There is a process to decide where you'll serve. You do have a lot of input in that process. There is less input the first couple of assignments when you're considered an untenured or junior officer, as they sometimes call folks who have only been in their first or second assignment. You have more limited choices. But you do have a lot of input into the assignment process, a lot of choice. However, the bottom line is, if the department says we need you here, you're required to go. And you sign a paper to that effect when you sign up for the Foreign Service. All right, some of the benefits that you can get in the Foreign Service. This is for those who want to know about money and housing and things like that, and not just the desire to go to Martinique and serve your country there, which is how, frankly, I got interested in the Foreign Service. I was a missionary in the island of Martinique, which is in the French West Indies, and we were the first missionaries for the church to serve in Martinique ever. We opened it up, And so we got involved in a lot of non-traditional missionary activities, such as playing baseball in a local baseball league, which was okay, because when you're an American in a French country, even if you only ever played, in the sandlot with your friends, you can still throw and hit better than most of the guys you're playing with, because they don't grow up playing or throwing balls or things. So we were good, even though we really weren't very good. And we met a young American there in the baseball league who worked for Chase Manhattan. The president of the baseball league worked for Chase Manhattan. And one day we met another young American. And I got to tell you, I loved Martinique. If you ever been to the Caribbean, you can understand why. And he was actually living on this island and getting paid to live there. And I said, so what is it that you do? He was a Colorado kid, and he explained to me what the Foreign Service was. So as a 19-year-old on Martinique, I decided that that's where I wanted to go and live and work. And one of the saddest days of my life is when the Soviet Union broke up. And that was because we then opened all these embassies in former Soviet republics and had to offset them by closing places like the consulate in Martinique. Anyway, there are a lot of good benefits to the Foreign Service. One of them, as you can see, after 20 years of service at the age of 50, if you decide that you've had enough and you want to go do something different, you can retire with a full pension. There's sick leave, home leave, other benefits. You can look those up and get more details if you want. Timeline, the Foreign Service sometimes takes a while to get in, so you have to be patient. You have to want it. We've tried to slim that down to a year or so. The process has just been changed. So this year is the first year where there is a new exam, and the process for entering the Foreign Service has changed significantly. So the first thing you have to do is basically submit an online application. And in that application, there's a personal narrative in which you answer questions about yourself. And after you finish the online application and the personal narrative, your application is reviewed in Washington by a panel, and you are then notified via email that you're okay to sign up for the written exam. The written exam is now taken online. Again, I'm dating myself. If any of you ever watched the old movie Spies Like Us with Chevy Chase, they describe the Foreign Service exam as you've got 4 hours to sit down and write down everything you've ever learned in your entire life. And it's not that far off. There are a broad range of questions on the general knowledge exam. It asks everything from art and literature to economics to computer science and management. So you need a broad background if you want to pass the Foreign Service written exam. There is also an essay. The exam has been streamlined to be on the internet. The testing is now done over 8-day periods, and you sign up for a seat, and it happens about 4 times a year, as opposed to the old system where it was once a year, and if you missed it, 1 year in Phoenix, I just forgot to go until 3 days later and remembered, oops. So you have a process that is new and is being tried for the first time. This year, there will be no tests offered overseas. They're all domestically. I would imagine that BYU is a test center. I haven't looked it up, but most major universities have a test center right here. If you pass the written test, and there are about 10% of the people that do, then you will be invited to an oral assessment in major cities across the U.S., Salt Lake not being one of them, I don't believe. You're looking at going to San Francisco or Washington or someplace. You go to an all-day oral assessment where you are assessed with other applicants. You do role plays and group projects and things like that. And they decide whether they think you can go on to the next session, segment, which is an in-depth interview. And then, assuming that they decide that they want you, you'll get medical and security clearances. That's the part that really takes the longest, depending on where you've lived and how many times you've changed your address and so forth, because somebody has to go around and verify all that information. When Corey mentioned that I had been an investigator right out of undergraduate school, that's what I did, was go around and check all the things people put on their applications to make sure they were true, talk to their neighbors and employers and all of that. So that's the process for getting in on the Foreign Service side, the Foreign Service officer side. Now there are also specialist jobs, And in these sorts of sessions, we tend to get a lot of political science majors, international relations majors, but we're also looking for a broad spectrum of people with other skills. When you go to an embassy overseas, it's basically like having a small town. You have police, which are diplomatic security people that ensure the safety and security of the building and the individuals there. We have computer specialists, we have accountants, we have personnel specialists, and you can see the long list of specific skills that we're looking for. These folks don't take the written exam. They spend, like Foreign Service officers, the majority of their careers overseas, but we're looking for their experience and education in those fields. So computer information technologists, for example, you don't have to know who wrote Catch-22 and which war it was about, as you would have to maybe if you took the Foreign Service exam. But you have to have skills in computers, and that's what we're looking for. And there are a number of programs to bring people in mid-level, into the middle part of their career if they've got experience and background in that work. So that's an option for those of you who may move more specialized, or if you have friends or relatives that are more specialized. As Corey said, John Dinkelman, who is a Mormon legend in the Foreign Service, everybody who's a member of the church seems to know of John Dinkelman, sent an announcement for construction engineers. We're building embassies all over the world, and we need people who know how to do that, to go overseas and build them for us. And once they're built, we need people who know how to keep them running. We have facility managers that run the facilities and make sure that they stay in operation. That's also opportunities for spouses. The State Department employs many civil servants, primarily in Washington, D.C., but around the country we have passport centers and other folks. And basically this is a sample list, but any job in the federal government, any job that you can imagine, we probably employ somebody in that somewhere. Most of these jobs are in Washington, D.C., and the process for finding out what these jobs are is to go online at USA Jobs, which is my former employer's website, OPM, the Office of Personnel Management, and they'll give you instructions on where to apply and what materials. It's more like a normal, if I can use that phrase, job, where there's an announcement, it's open, you submit your application, and then they hire you or they don't. And there are a lot of opportunities in the civil service. I'm surprised that this presentation a little bit keeps emphasizing those jobs. You don't have to take the test for this one. It's really not that bad. Mostly in D.C., and sometimes those in the civil service can get opportunities to go overseas, particularly Iraq right now. There are plenty of opportunities for civil servants to go there and serve. Civil servants usually have an opportunity to go to those jobs that haven't been filled by Foreign Service officers or specialists. Student programs, there are internships. You have to be U.S. citizens because you have to get a security clearance. The program, the presentation's a couple years old. So for 2008 internships, you need to apply by November of this year. But there are a number of student programs, Pickering fellowships. Some of them actually will pay for graduate school. The Pickering Fellowship, for example, the Department of State pays for your graduate school in exchange for so many years of service afterwards. The first summer after Pickering, you do an internship in Washington, D.C. that's paid. And the second year you do an internship in an embassy overseas, which is paid, which is a good benefit because many of the regular student internships for undergrads are unpaid internships, but you have the opportunity to live and work overseas. There are the websites that you want to see, the careers at state or at state.gov. And if you just go to the main website, www.state.gov, there are links to all the rest of this, and it's easy to find. The other one you want to see is USA Jobs. PMI also, Presidential Management Intern. I'm assuming that's still a good website, although it's now called Presidential Management Fellow. And that is a program for people coming right out of graduate school. It's an exceptional program, highly competitive. Department of State is not the only federal agency that uses this program. In fact, all federal agencies have access to it. It's administered through OPM. And students go into a 2-year fellowship following graduation from graduate school, where they are in a civil service job, and at the end of that job, they normally move into a permanent career position with the agency that they're hired into. So that's a great opportunity for those of you who are in grad school. And you can get additional information about applying to the Department of State at that website. Now that's it for the PowerPoint. As I said, that's sort of a brief overview. If you go onto the website, you can get a lot more detailed information. You can watch videos about beautiful people that have recently joined the Department of State. You'll be surprised to know I'm not in any of those videos. I haven't figured that one out yet. It sounds like the gentleman that's coming on Wednesday, if he's a second secretary and vice consul, is probably in his first or second assignment with the Department of State. So he'll be a good one to ask questions of for somebody who's just entered. I'm what we call a mid-level officer. I'm sort of in the middle of my career. So I've had a few of the experiences being a consular officer, giving out visas, helping people with passports, things like that. And other than that, I've mostly done administrative assignments. But we've done some interesting things. We've evacuated the embassy in Caracas while I was there. My wife and kids came back to Bountiful, which is where I'm originally from. Don't hold that against me either. Utah was an economic decision. I would have come here if I didn't have a scholarship there. So in Greece, we were there when November 17 was still active. In fact, the summer after we left Greece, the British military attaché was assassinated. We were also in Athens during the Bosnian War, when the United States and its NATO allies bombed the Serbs. So we had daily demonstrations for about 4 months at the embassy. It was an interesting experience. We were in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, when the Intifada started again in Palestine, and we were required to stay in our housing area for much of the time. We were only allowed out for emergencies. One time we had an emergency and just had to go to Wendy's. So we left the diplomatic quarter where our housing was, and we pulled up to a stoplight, which was staffed with police officers. The major stoplights had a very strong police presence all of a sudden because there was threat of terrorist activities. And we saw the poor policeman. He could identify us by our diplomatic license plates on our car, and we were about 2 or 3 cars back. And he made the cars in front of us move so he could get us on our way because he didn't want us sitting at that light next to him, which was great because we were able to get into Wendy's quickly and get home. When you have little kids, emergencies take on different aspects. So it seems like, and in Caracas we had the evacuation because if any of you have studied Latin American affairs, you know that the leadership in Venezuela right now is somewhat anti-American and anti-democratic. It was in full bloom, or getting started, I should say, when we were there. There was a work stoppage which we feared would lead to violence, and a decision was made to evacuate all non-emergency personnel and all families from the country. And so for about 2.5 months they were out. We were out of gasoline and many other rations. It was ironic that in the 4th largest producer of oil in the world, there was no gasoline to be had because they refine it elsewhere, and so they were having to cart in gasoline. And every once in a while the station would open for a few hours, and we kept very close tabs on everything and would run a convoy of about 20 cars out to a gas station when it was open with armed security. And we also built our own gas station at the embassy with some water tanks that we had just for regular watering. We made a gas station and we acquired gasoline. So there was much celebrating and as we filled these tanks full of gas. And then we didn't end up using it. But it was our emergency supply in case we all had to get in cars and drive across land to exit the country. Because there's only one road to the airport, which is a large bridge that collapsed after we left, too. So everywhere we go, just as we're leaving, the country's falling apart. We've warned the Belgians we're going to leave in a year from Brussels. We've said we don't know what's going to happen, but something bad's happening this year. So I'm going to pause for a minute and allow you a chance to answer questions. We have about 15 minutes, I think, left, if my addition is correct. And so I want to give you an opportunity to ask questions. If there aren't too many questions, then I'll continue rambling. But I want to make sure that I focus on a few things. Please. And I think you have to speak into the microphone, right? The gentleman with the Puma shirt? Oh, no, I can't see it.
Hi, my question is kind of a twofold question. I have thought about the Foreign Service, but my concern would be reconciling personal ideas and probably beliefs that I have with certain policies that might end up being enforced. And that's the first part of the question. The second part is, even if I do find something that I'm passionate about and that I like the direction and the policy that I am supporting, there's changes in administrations every 4 to 8 years. For example, just as an example, say I was working on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict under Clinton, and then Bush comes in, and that kind of takes a whole different approach. So,
excellent question.
That's my question.
Excellent question. And let me address it. It's kind of two prongs of the same question, really. We serve the current administration. The current president is the one who makes decisions about United States foreign policy. Fortunately, through history, changes in party in the presidency don't tend to have major changes in the conduct of U.S. foreign policy. You'll hear a lot of discussion during the elections about differences and how we need to do this and that and the other. But once a new party is in power, some of the techniques or focus can change a little bit, but sometimes the events themselves really drive our foreign policy. Madeleine Albright was very active in Israel and Palestine when she was in power, when she was in office. I won't say that Colin Powell's been my favorite Secretary of State. I've served under 4 Secretaries of State, and they each have their own style. But the policies that we actually follow haven't changed that much. They're responding to their president. The focus has changed. Obviously, the focus of American foreign policy right now is Iraq, which means that Israel and Palestine haven't got the attention that some people think that they deserve. Does that mean that we're not engaged there? No, not at all. In fact, Cairo it used to be the largest embassy in the world. Now it's one of the largest embassies in the world. Iraq is the largest U.S. embassy currently in Baghdad. So we're still working there. We still have an active embassy. People are still working the issues. They're just not making the news as much because it's not at the forefront of what we're doing, at the forefront of the president's focus. The current president, when he came into office, really wanted to focus on Latin America. If you hear some of his early speeches, he was going to be a president for the Americas. But things happening in the Middle East, in Iraq and Afghanistan, took his attention away from that. I may sneak down here on Wednesday if we're not at L.A. Goon with the younger kids, because China and India are becoming extremely important. I think that'll be an interesting discussion to be involved in. And yet you don't hear that much about what we're doing there, but we're there. We're there with a large embassy, with a growing embassy. In fact, if you're interested in languages that the department is really looking at right now, Arabic is one because of the importance of the Middle East and Iraq. China and Hindi are the other two that they're really focused on. Now you look at Latin America, Portuguese, Spanish, Africa, French, Portuguese, a little English. Those are important languages and those are important regions, but they're not our focus. Still, we have 285 embassies worldwide. We have representation in almost every country. So even though, and it's hard when you're in the Foreign Service because sometimes you feel like since the focus is in Iraq, maybe you're not getting appreciated for what you're doing. But we have important work going on all over the place, including Europe. I work right now at the U.S. mission to NATO. It's not a traditional embassy. It's right there in Belgium where we have 3 U.S. missions. And our constituency, or the group that we're working with, are 25 allied nations in Europe and in North America, because Canada's part of it as well. And our focus is, what are we doing as NATO to protect these countries and the rest of the world? We have global partnerships at USNATO with countries all over the world, Japan, Australia, some of the other European countries. NATO is taking the lead in Afghanistan now. The U.S. is backing away, and NATO's taking over. And so what our mission does in encouraging NATO to take those on is very important. So that's kind of the first part of your question. If you're focused on Israel and Palestinian issues, you can probably have a good career focusing on those things. If you don't like what the administration is saying, then working in the State Department is the opportunity to change their mind. You have the opportunity to do fair and open analysis of what's happening in the country, submit those reports to the decision makers, and hopefully influence what they're doing. Now, if they say, well, that's not really the direction that we want to go, then it's your responsibility publicly and with those who would take what you're saying to be State Department speak to support the administration's position. Doesn't mean you have to give up on your principles. That just means there are other bodies where I've heard this work, like the Quorum of the 12, where they may not all agree, but once the president says this is the way it is, everybody says, okay, this is the way it is. I'm not comparing our president to the Quorum of the 12, but the principle is similar. This is the official line, and that's the way we go. During Vietnam, State Department had a number of people that resigned. During Bosnia and Serbia, there were a few that resigned publicly. We haven't had many resignations, at least public ones, during the Iraq conflict. And there are a lot of people who don't feel privately that the direction we're going right now is the right one. But in public, that's the policy, and we support it. And we do what we can to support the president and his policies. Sir.
My question is kind of about the life that you and your family would live while overseas. I'm wondering if in most embassies you're required to live on embassy grounds, whether or not your children are encouraged or required to attend a specific international school, and whether that kind of separation encourages any kind of elitism, especially among your children as they're growing up separate from all of the kids around them.
Good question. In fact, most embassies do not have compound housing. Most places you live on the economy. Either in some places we own some property, but for the majority of countries, the State Department leases properties, which is another plug for those who do leasing and construction kind of work. We have people running $1 billion worth of property overseas. So we live in rented apartments, rented houses. There are usually international schools that you can send your kids to, not always. The option to send your kids to the local school is always available to you, and some people choose that. We have not, as a personal choice, and one of the reasons, even though I'd like my kids to speak perfect French, in Belgium, because moving every 2 to 3 years, sometimes 4 years, if you really stay a long time in a place, is disruptive enough. So we like to keep them in schools that have a similar curriculum. Many of the international schools, I would say most of the international schools have